On the first morning of September 1939, as summer air clung stubbornly to the forests of Pomerania, the world was already sliding into a new era of total war. Before most nations could grasp the full meaning of what was unfolding, Polish soldiers were already fighting for their lives, alone, outnumbered, and yet unwavering in their resolve. Among them stood the men of the Polish 18th Pomeranian Uhlans Regiment, whose bravery at Krojanty would become both an act of tactical necessity and a symbol of the country's unyielding spirit. Their story would be twisted, mythologized, and misrepresented throughout the war, but the truth, when told properly, reveals one of the most dramatic small-unit engagements of the 20th century. At dawn that day, the German army unleashed Fall Weiss, the invasion plan designed to crush Poland with speed and overwhelming force. The German Fourth Army, supported by mechanized divisions, infantry, and the newly honed doctrine of blitzkrieg, crossed the border with precision and efficient brutality. Polish forces in the north, though courageous and well-trained, found themselves under immense pressure as German formations advanced along key routes toward Świesnice and Tuchola. The forests, marshlands, and rolling fields of the region became chaotic battlegrounds in mere hours. For the Polish 18th Uhlans, commanded by Colonel Kazimierz Mastalerz, the first hours of the war demanded immediate action. They had trained relentlessly, preparing for reconnaissance, screening, and delaying tactics. Contrary to myths, they were not an antiquated cavalry force wielding sabers against tanks. They were a modernized formation, mounted infantry, equipped with rifles, carbines, machine guns, and anti-tank weapons. Their horses were not instruments for medieval charges, but a means to move quickly through terrain where motorized vehicles could not maneuver. Yet war has its moments where reality forces decisions that appear almost cinematic. For the Uhlans, Krojanty would be such a moment. By midday, the German infantry elements of the 20th Motorized Division pushed aggressively along a railway embankment near the village of Krojanty. Their goal was simple: break through and outflank Polish defensive positions near Świesnice. If successful, they would cut off entire Polish units and accelerate the collapse of the northern defense corridor. Polish scouts, moving silently through thickets of underbrush, observed the German infantry marching in relaxed formation, unaware of Polish forces nearby. These German units had outpaced armored support and were moving with the confidence of an army that believed the enemy was already shattered. When Colonel Mastalerz received the report, he understood instantly that this was a fleeting opportunity. If the German infantry were allowed to continue unopposed, they would overwhelm Polish positions within the hour. The Uhlans were tired, the heat relentless, but morale held firm. Mastalerz, a seasoned officer with absolute clarity of purpose, issued the decisive command. The cavalry would mount and execute a rapid assault to disrupt and delay the enemy.
What came next would echo through military history. The Polish squadron, under Captain Eugeniusz Świestiak, moved swiftly toward a concealed staging position behind a patch of forest. The men checked their weapons, adjusted saddle straps, and steadied their breathing. They were not charging out of desperation, they were executing a tactical strike against unprepared infantry. The terrain favored them. Open meadows bordered by forest, just long enough for a short, decisive charge. As the sun dipped toward late afternoon, its light stretched long shadows across the clearing. Mastalerz gave a final nod to Świestiak. No speech, no dramatics. The time for words had passed before sunrise. The command rang out. Lances lovered, sabers flashed in the golden haze. Hooves thundered against the earth as the cavalry burst from the tree line like a sudden storm. The sight of nearly 100 mounted soldiers erupting from the woods must have been astonishing, even terrifying to the German infantry, who had expected no resistance in this sector. For a brief moment, the charge achieved exactly what Mastalerz intended. German troops scrambled into disarray. Rifles fell from hands, shouts rippled through the ranks, and men dove for cover behind railway berms and scattered equipment. The Uhlans crashed into their flank with speed that few modern armies had ever witnessed. The clash was violent and immediate, horses sweeping through the field like meteors, Uhlans firing carbines from the saddle, and sabers striking at close quarters. While sabers were used, they were not archaic symbols of old warfare. They were tools for close combat, exactly as doctrine dictated for mounted infantry exploitation. The shock of the attack shattered German cohesion. Those who could retreated toward the embankment, desperately firing as they ran. Others simply froze, overwhelmed by the speed and ferocity of the charge. Szwestiak led from the front, shouting orders through the chaos. For minutes that felt like hours, the clearing was a maelstrom of noise. The crack of rifle fire, the clash of steel, the screams of wounded men, and the pounding beat of terrified horses navigating the frenzy around them. The charge succeeded. It broke the German line and forced a retreat. But war is rarely content to allow one clean victory. As the Uhlans consolidated their position, German armored reconnaissance vehicles, SDKFZ 221 and 222 armored cars arrived unexpectedly from the forest road beyond the clearing. These were light armored cars, equipped with machine guns and in some cases 20mm autocannons. They were fast, mobile, and deadly against exposed troops. The Germans opened fire. Bullets tore through the clearing. Dirt and grass erupted as machine gun bursts stitched across the battlefield. Horses reared or fell. Men threw themselves for cover or returned fire as best they could. Captain Szwestiak was struck down during this sudden burst of fire, leaving Mastalerz to attempt to rescue. Eyewitness accounts describe Mastalerz galloping through a storm of gunfire in a desperate effort to reach his fallen officer, a testament to leadership defined by loyalty rather than self-preservation. Both men would fall in those moments. The loss was devastating, but their sacrifice had not been in vain. The charge had bought the Polish infantry precious time to regroup and reposition. It forced the Germans to halt their forward momentum and await additional support. For a crucial window of time on the first day of the war, a single squadron of cavalry had disrupted the advance of a mechanized division. Yet the true battle was not only the clash at Krojanty, it was also the story that followed. Several foreign correspondents arrived later, after the dust had settled. They encountered the aftermath: Polish cavalrymen dead beside their horses, and nearby, armored German vehicles. From this tableau emerged one of the most persistent myths of World War II, that the Polish cavalry, in blind patriotism or foolish desperation, had charged German tanks with sabers.
The story quickly spread among German propagandists, who eagerly seized the opportunity to paint Poland as backward and primitive, reinforcing the image of German mechanized superiority. The truth, however, was far more nuanced and far more interesting. The Uhlans had attacked infantry, not tanks. They had done so successfully, and they had only come under fire from armored cars after the charge was already complete. Modern historians have since set the record straight. The man of the 18th Uhlan Regiment executed a disciplined, calculated strike against a vulnerable enemy unit, a maneuver entirely consistent with their training and with military doctrine of the time. They did not mistake armored cars for infantry. They did not commit suicide. They performed their duty with professionalism and valor. The tragedy and heroism of Krojanty lie not in myth, but in the stark reality. A small group of Polish soldiers, outmatched in firepower and strategic resources, fought with extraordinary resolve against overwhelming odds. Their actions serve as a reminder that the opening days of the war were not defined by Polish incompetence, but by the sheer magnitude of the German war machine. The broader Polish campaign was marked by numerous examples of professional, disciplined resistance. Despite fighting on two fronts, Germany from the west, the Soviet Union from the east, Polish forces continued to resist far longer than German strategists anticipated. Even after the fall of Warsaw, Polish soldiers would go on to fight in every major theater of the war: in the skies over Britain, on the sands of North Africa, on the frozen Italian front at Monte Cassino, and in resistance operations across occupied Europe. And in each of these battles, the spirit of those early defenders, men like Mastalerz, Szwestak, and the Uhlans at Krojanty, lived on. Returning to that first day of September, as dusk fell across the scarred clearing near the railway embankment, the surviving Uhlans regrouped. They gathered what wounded they could, retreated toward Polish lines, and prepared for the next fight. There was no time to mourn, no time to reflect. Every hour brought new German assaults, new encirclements, new demands for sacrifice. And yet, despite losing their colonel, despite being forced back by armored fire, the Uhlans remained unbroken. Krojanty was not a decisive battle in the strategic scope of the campaign. It did not alter the course of the invasion, nor did it stop the German tide. But it mattered profoundly in another way: morally, symbolically, and historically. For Poland, it was a moment of fierce resistance that demonstrated courage in the face of certain adversity. For the world, it became an example of how narratives of war can be distorted when examined only through propaganda or simplified accounts. For those who study the battle today, the truth reveals a simpler, more powerful reality. The Polish cavalry charge at Krojanty was effective. It succeeded in its immediate objective: breaking and delaying German infantry. It inflicted casualties, caused confusion, and forced the enemy to halt. It was a legitimate military action executed by trained soldiers who understood the risks but also understood their duty. The men who rode into that clearing knew the immense odds stacked against them. They had seen the Luftwaffe strike Polish cities in columns earlier that morning. They heard the explosions, watched the sky darkened with smoke, and recognized that this war would not resemble any they had trained for. But they also knew their homeland depended on every hour they could buy, every enemy unit they could disrupt, every gap they could force the Germans to close. In the decades following the war, veterans of the 18th Uhlans shared their accounts with remarkable consistency. They spoke not of suicidal heroics, but of calculated decision-making. They emphasized that their horses were tools for mobility, not symbols of outdated warfare. And they spoke of their fallen officers with reverence, particularly Colonel Mastalerz, whose leadership embodied the highest ideals of military service. Today, near Krojanty, a monument stands in honor of those who fought and died on that September day. It features a bronze cavalryman in full charge, his horse rearing under him, frozen in a moment of impossible bravery. It does not romanticize the battle, rather it anchors the memory of what truly happened. The monument reminds visitors that war is complex, that truth is often overshadowed by myth, and that courage takes many forms, not all of them grand, and not all of them victorious. The charge at Krojanty invites us to reconsider our assumptions about the early days of World War II. It compels us to confront the reality that Poland did not fall because its soldiers were unprepared or incompetent, but because they faced an enemy whose military, industrial, and strategic power dwarfed their own. And yet, even in the face of that, the Polish army fought with undeniable skill and unwavering resolve. It also compels us to recognize how historical narratives can be shaped, not always by what happened, but by who tells the story afterward. For decades, the myth of Polish cavalry charging tanks persisted, overshadowing the truth. But myths cannot erase the reality experienced by the men who lived it. They cannot diminish the disciplined courage of soldiers like the 18th Uhlans. They cannot obscure the tactical success the charge achieved in its initial phase. And they cannot silence the voices of survivors who made clear that they acted not out of desperation, but out of necessity. On the battlefield that day, The haze of dust, gunpowder, and churned earth eventually settled into an uneasy quiet. German armored cars resumed their advance, infantry reorganized, and the arm of mechanized warfare pushed onward into Poland. But for a short span in the late afternoon, the German advance had been halted, stopped not by tanks or artillery, but by the determination of mounted soldiers who refused to yield.
Every war has its defining moments of courage. For Poland, Krojanty stands among them. As the sun finally set on 1 September 1939, long shadows stretched across the fields where the Uhlans had fought. Survivors moved through the remains of the battlefield, collecting ammunition, tending to wounded horses, and preparing once again to mount up. They knew the war had only just begun. They knew the enemy advantage was overwhelming. But they also knew something else, something more important than the tactical map or the mounting losses. They had shown in those first hours of the conflict that Poland would resist fiercely, honorably, and without hesitation. For the German infantry who survived the charge, the memory of the Uhlans was etched deeply and permanently. Several accounts from German veterans admitted their shock at the speed, precision, and force of the mounted assault. It was not a moment of ridicule, but one of respect, an acknowledgment that bravery and professionalism can emerge unexpectedly, even against a mechanized army marching under the confidence of blitzkrieg. In the years that followed, as historians revisited the events of Krojanty, the narrative evolved. Scholars uncovered reports, field logs, diaries, and testimonies that pieced together a more accurate picture of what had happened. Slowly the myth began to fade, and what remained was something far more compelling than propaganda. A real story of real men acting in real conditions of extreme pressure and uncertainty. War often distorts clarity in the fog of chaos, but time restores truth. Today, when we speak of the Polish cavalry at Krojanty, we speak of a tactical decision rooted in urgency. We speak of a charge that succeeded, even at terrible cost. We speak of officers who led from the front, soldiers who fought with discipline, and a regiment that held firm to its mission despite impossible odds. We speak of how, even in defeat, courage can carve its place into history. The Polish cavalry charge at Krojanty was not the last cavalry charge in European warfare, nor was it the most strategically significant. But its symbolic weight endures. It stands as a reminder that valor does not require victory, that resolve does not require equal footing, and that the human spirit can manifest profound courage at the darkest moments. Ultimately, the story is not about horses versus machines. It is about human beings, those who rode into gunfire because their country needed minutes, not hours, because their comrades depended on them, because the defense of Poland, on that first day of the war, hung by the thinnest of threads. And so, as we reflect on that late afternoon in a clearing near Krojanty, we are left with a singular truth. The Uhlans rode not toward death, but toward duty. They charged not because they expected triumph, but because they hoped to buy time for others to fight anew. They fought not as relics of a bygone era, but as soldiers confronting the brutal dawn of mechanized warfare. Their charge broke the German line. Their sacrifice delayed the enemy advance. Their memory endures, not in myth, but in the undeniable reality of their courage.